Thanks very much, Dee, and good morning, everybody. My role this morning here is to set the scene, as Dee has already said, in terms of the current labour market within the construction industry in Ireland. I have solving the labour market imbalances, information, collaboration, innovation and incentivisation. I'm not even sure if incentivisation is a real word, but I think it sounded good. Brexit wasn't a word 5 years ago either, so I'm happy to press on. My function this morning, as I said, is to provide an economic context and an examination of some of the key headline data pertaining to the construction labour market in Ireland. And I'll start by showing some of the baseline indicators. On the left here you see from the economy as a whole, on the right the construction contribution to these baseline figures. In terms of output, we're doing very well in Ireland as a whole, with 6.7% GDP growth recorded in 2018, 6.6% of which was related to the construction industry, valued at just over €20 billion. In terms of employment, we are doing very well in terms of trends pertaining to our overall labour market. Our unemployment rate down to 5.4, edging ever closer to our natural rate of unemployment, which is anywhere between, depends on who you listen to, between 3 and 4.5%. Construction unemployment are those who are currently unemployed but identified as having previously worked in the construction industry, is down to 6.7%, which is another very positive trend for construction, because between 2008 and 2012, 1 in 2 people who became unemployed had actually come from the construction sector. Construction labour market is very difficult to define and to outline because it's so complex. There's so many workers involved in the sector, and measuring the quantum of workers is not as easy as you would think. The CSO classification, in fact the European classification for construction employment, it involves direct employment, literally on-site employment, and that stands at just over 145,500 people at the moment. When you include indirect employment, people working within the professions and indirectly to construction, it's estimated that you can add an additional 40% onto that, so bringing the total up to 203,700, or 8.9% of overall employment within the country. Just to put that into context, that 6.3% is comparable to the European average for proportion of workers working in the construction sector. The final indicator I have noted here is pertaining to prices. When we're looking at the labour market and we're looking at shortages in the labour market, obviously that has a critical impact in terms of tender price indices in Ireland, and that can be seen by looking at this particular figure, the bottom right here, 7.5% estimated tender price inflation at the moment for construction tender price inflation, vis-a-vis 1.1% consumer price inflation overall. So from an economic perspective, we are coming at it from a very positive recent performance and future outlook for the economy as a whole, with growth forecast to continue in the next number of years, and construction playing a key part in that. So just to put this into context in terms of the trends, and as a precursor to looking at the impact of the severity of the fluctuation within the construction industry, I've mapped here the construction output, which is the green line, the value of construction output, and the purple here represents the 12% of GNP over these years. It's generally accepted that for an economy of our size, with the existing infrastructure of our size, that a sustainable level of construction output is somewhere between 10 to 12% of GNP. So the purple line shows you the 12% of GNP. The green shows you what the actual situation is. So it doesn't really require a huge amount of explanation or analysis to see the severity of the downturn from 2007 onwards, but also to see where we are now. We're at about 8.6% of GNP at the moment in terms of the value of construction output. So this severity in terms of output is reflected in terms of employment as well, which has given rise to some of the issues we're currently facing. and I'll talk about that in a moment. But before I do, let's just have a quick look to see who our construction workers actually are. On the left-hand side here, we have what we call our construction family of trades. These are direct employment. You see that electricians aren't there because in terms of the SOLAS classifications, they're actually not in construction, but we do know obviously that we have an awful lot of people employed as electricians. And the right give an indication of some of the professions involved in construction. So it's a complex labour market to analyse because of the type of information that is publicly accessible, but also given the number of players involved, and of course along the whole supply chain within the construction project delivery as well. When we look at the trends pertaining to employment, direct and indirect employment, this figure shows you where we currently are, about 8.9%. There's a slight divergence here because the earlier figure was seasonally adjusted and the figure I'm using here isn't. So if you're picking up the difference between the 8.6 and the 8.9, that explains why. Or it's probably too early in the morning for you to have noticed had I not just raised it with you anyway. So you can see again the trend in this regard. The downturn there between from 2007 onwards in terms of both direct and indirect employment has had a really, really huge impact and is a consequence of where we are today with the skills shortage. When we take a further examination in terms of the composition of the labour market, there are some interesting findings here, and I apologise for the stereotypical blue for boy and pink for girls, but they were the only illustrations I could find to make my point here. So when you break this down, we also see not only is it a complex market, it's a labour market, there is a huge number of players, which makes it difficult to estimate, but there is also another very stark reality. There's a severe shortage of females working within the sector. When you go down, as I tend to do for just enjoyment in the CSO data pertaining to labour market stats, you'll see that the construction sector proportionately has the lowest proportion of females than any other sector. Okay, so when you're looking at things like agriculture, forestry, fishery, they have proportionally greater number of females than construction do. And then you have other sectors that have slightly more females. But construction is noteworthy in terms of the lack of diversity from a gender perspective within the sector. The two side by side here are looked at Q4 versus Q2. Q2 2007 represents the peak of construction employment. So again, quantifying the complete the decimation in terms of construction employment between peak and current. And this is current, it's not trough. So you can see that there's a significant difference here. When you look at the trends of construction employment overall versus employment within the economy overall, the green reflects the economy, and looking at the left-hand vertical axis here for the scale there, and the right-hand relating to construction. I put this up purely so you can see the trend. So the employment within the economy overall did reduce, but you can see by the purple line there the comparable in terms of the extent of the drop in construction vis-a-vis overall employment. Okay, so I think it makes for stark viewing there. And you know, the impact of this, of course, is that given the level of the downturn, we have a couple of consequences of this. Not only do we have an increase in emigration, which is a very personal thing that affects families. We have people moving out of the construction sector. We have people retraining in other areas. We also have a reduction in the number of students wishing to choose construction education programmes when they finish school. So the reputation of the sector as a secure, ongoing, sustainable source of employment then becomes affected, and it takes some amount of time to address and change that perspective, and I think we're seeing that at the moment. One of the pieces of research that I've done in this regard was on behalf of the Society of Chartered Surveyors, and the purpose of this report, that was in fact published last year, was to determine and quantify the extent of the shortage, in this instance for surveying professions. I've put a summary here for quantity surveying specifically. wherein you see the horizontal line there represents total numbers nationwide of people undertaking quantity surveying degree programmes at that time. It covers the period 2018 to 2021, which is broadly aligned with the 4-year honours degree programme required to be eligible to become a chartered surveyor. We targeted a single senior person in every QS member practice of the SCSI, and they answered on behalf of their organisation in terms of, based on 3 scenarios of economic growth, how many people they were going to take on at every level. And I was able to compare the supply side, i.e. that the throughput from the 3rd level system, with the demand side coming from industry directly. I have to say the 3 scenarios of economic growth were very, very conservative. I normally do that. The pessimistic was a 2% growth, the median was a 3%, and the optimistic was a 4% per annum growth. So you can even see the optimistic figure there is actually very, very mooted in terms of the actual growth that has occurred. But bearing in mind it goes through to 2021, growth probably not likely to continue at the 6.5% that it is now. So 1,700 of a shortage just for quantity surveying projected between now and 2021. So very, very serious in terms of the delivery and the capability of ensuring that we are able to deliver on time, on budget, things both in the private sector, projects in the private sector, but also in terms of the rollout of the NDP over the 9 years that are left on it and the €116 billion expenditure. And I remind you to think back to the tender price indices that I showed in an earlier slide at 7.5%. Much of the research will show that a significant portion of that is resulting from pressures in terms of the construction labour market and availability of skilled labour. So that's just an example from the quantity surveying side. In terms of the direct employment, another study published last year in conjunction with the CIF this time identified some of the factors that are shaping and impacting their own membership there. Quite significantly, 86% of respondent firms said there's not sufficient skills available, so a considerable number there as well. And 81% of respondents said they do employ tradespeople, but 71% of those said they actually do not employ apprentices. Now, that's a really, really critical finding from this report. There's several reasons why. Some of them were that legislative arrangements were too onerous. Others were that there's a residual uncertainty in engaging and employing an apprentice because of the 4-year cycle and the uncertainty as to whether the workflow will be there. And that was a key thing. Of the 71 that do not currently employ an apprentice, 46% said they previously did, but now are not doing so. So that's just some of the key trends in that regard. But these 2 reports aren't on their own. There's a huge number of reports that have been published pertaining to the skills shortage, and Dee has outlined the recently published EI report that noted, correct me if I'm wrong here, 6,000 opportunities for qualified engineers and nowhere near enough graduates coming through the system to meet that. The SCSI have also in the report identified that there is a minimum of 2,000 in terms of a shortage of surveyors, but could be as high as 3,900 over surveying professions overall, based on the optimistic, so to include land surveyors and property surveyors in that. The ACOM have recently published a report. 40% of respondents to their report say that the skills and talent is the single largest factor affecting construction firms. The RICS found a similar figure, slightly higher. Turner Townsend found something similar as well. 65.5% of the regions surveyed within their global report identified skills as being the single largest factor impacting their membership. So much so, as we know, a number of professions have been added to the critical skills list, including M&E engineers with BIM capabilities, QSs and construction project managers as well. So I hope that goes some way to set the scene in terms of, look, what does our construction labour market actually look like? Who are they? Who are the players? And what's currently going on? And importantly, looking at the trends and the impact of some of those trends. We also need to know what causes them. And I don't need to tell you what causes them, so I'll rush through this slide fairly quickly. Obviously, we have what I've already mentioned in terms of the pro-cyclical demand for employees. We've got pro-cyclical demand for construction programmes as well, and sometimes from a third level perspective we can't flex up and down very quickly, and that causes another kind of chink in the process as well. There's a complete lack of diversity within the sector. We're not tapping into our labour force as effectively as we could. There's a poor reputation in terms of the security of tenure of employment within the sector, which is acting as a discouraging factor for entering into it. Emigration and the use of subcontract labour in particular, thus not taking on direct employees or apprentices, is a key thing. The net impact of that, of course, is that we're going to have wage inflation, tender price inflation, and it does have a significant impact in our ability and our capacity to deliver our much needed infrastructure in the rollout of the NDP. It also has an impact when we're putting a value of 116 billion in the expenditure. In that alone, of course, this is the public sector, we have the private sector as well, but in terms of the value for money that we can get. Also, given the reputation, we have insufficient inward migration because of that residual uncertainty about job security going forward. So the extent and the speed and the depth of the downturn in terms of construction, the demand for construction labour is having a really long-lasting impact. So what do we do about it? Well, I'm excited to hear from some of the other speakers that are coming up this morning in terms of solutions and how we do make the industry more attractive to people entering into it, and looking at innovative ways in order not only to deliver and design our curricula, but also to demonstrate the variety of work that is involved within the construction sector. And I think that can be very much emphasised in what we're going to be hearing about in just a few minutes. From a personal basis, I think it requires a four-stage process. I think firstly we need information, collaboration, innovation, and that word incentivisation. It kept coming up with the red line underneath it, and I was convinced it was a word, but hopefully it will make it there now, even if it isn't already. What do we need by way of information? We need to be able to quantify accurately the shortage. We need more data pertaining to labour market trends. As I said, we have so many players, so many people involved in the construction labour market at the moment, and sometimes the data pertaining to the numbers of people working is less than perfect. So we need to have, we need to be able to quantify it. We need to generate a greater awareness of the wide-ranging opportunities that are available, the career advancement available within the sector. We need to know what the stakeholders require to facilitate in terms of addressing the shortage. So we need knowledge, we need information, we need market intelligence, and we need to do it given the fragmented nature of the sector and the structure of the industry in terms of the very, very small number of large firms and the huge number of small firms. We need to collaborate, we need the stakeholders to come together to create and build momentum. There's great work being done at the moment in terms of creating an awareness of the opportunities within and demonstrating the attractiveness of construction as a career opportunity, and we've done really well in that, and we need to continue to do that. We need collaboration to ensure we've got industry-informed curriculum from both undergraduate, postgraduate, and from a continuous professional development perspective as well. Collaborate in terms of funding opportunities to deliver in terms of technology, and we should be using technology as not only, should not only be collaborating through technology, but also to drive technology implementation across all stakeholders. In particular, I'll highlight here SMEs, who sometimes may not necessarily have the funding to invest, and therefore particular care should be taken to ensure that SMEs, given the proportion of SMEs within construction, if we want that transformation to happen, SMEs are fundamental in that. We need to be innovative. and I repeat, I'm interested in dying to hear what other speakers have to say in this in terms of curriculum design and delivery. We also need to take a strategic approach. We need to take a strategic approach to technology within the sector. We also need to take a strategic approach, and organisations need to take a strategic approach to manpower planning within their own organisations as well, not to perhaps ensure that they are using their own existing resources, those 200,000 people, more effectively and more efficiently and more productively as well. We need to benchmark ourselves against best in the class. Again, some of the examples that we have no pressure, but we're benchmarking our own innovations against what we're going to hear. And perhaps that does require a level of subsidy in terms of driving innovation. So we do start to think and act a little bit more creatively. It is a change. It does require a change overall, and sometimes we do need some incentives in order to make that change. Again, a huge amount of progress has been made over the last number of years, but we need to continue to highlight the job opportunities, the varied career opportunities and opportunities for advancement within the sector. And we perhaps need to incentivise companies to take on apprenticeships. One very positive development in this regard is the shared apprenticeship programme that's been piloted at the moment, whereby an employer doesn't have to hold on to the same apprentice for the whole 4-year duration, and I think that's a very positive step forward. In terms of technology and the subsidies, we need to look at funding opportunities to ensure that the training and the investment that needs to come for technology is put in place. We also need to look at lifelong learning to incentivise people to continue, the existing workforce to continue in lifelong learning and upskill, particularly in the area of digital technology, and in the implementation and the rollout of the roadmap. That's going to be really, really important when you look at the age profile of our existing labour force within construction, and also looking at the duration of a career potentially in construction. We need to look at CPD and perhaps investing in that as well. So I feel like if my voice has gone now because I'm talking so quickly to get through these. Hopefully that's given you an overview of where we currently are and the extent of the shortage, and given you some kind of sound bites in what we should be thinking about in terms of collaboration and being innovative in the way we do things. So to summarise, I think what we need to do is we need to quantify the extent of the problem, need to get a little bit more market intelligence in that regard, so that we can collaborate amongst all stakeholders to identify solutions. We need to think outside the box, perhaps be a little bit more innovative and benchmark against other initiatives that are taking place elsewhere. But we have to realise that it may need incentive. We probably do need more government funding, and every stakeholder probably can put a hand up to that one. But I think it's absolutely critical that we do so in a kind of a strategic fashion, such that we are building and we are addressing this labour shortage now with a long-term perspective, so that we can generate a sustainable construction labour force, so that we don't have the severity of the downturn going forward. And I think a strategic approach to future planning now is absolutely critical in that regard. I will leave it at that, so thank you very much.